Hey everyone, tarekith here, and today I wanted to do a somewhat quick video talking about some of the gear I've reviewed on this channel over the last few years, as well as some pieces that I've played with that unfortunately for various reasons I never got to do an actual review of for the YouTube channel. I get a lot of people who kind of contact me looking for advice on gear that I reviewed, and most of the time they don't realize that I no longer have that anymore and just can't look up what they're asking me. So I just want to give people a quick update on some of my thoughts of the gear I've used over the last few years, what I've kept, what I've sold, as well as talk about some things that I spent some time playing with that just never got a proper review. So let's start way back with the Elektron Analog Rytm Mark II. To start with, I actually really love the look of this box. I think Electron did a great job with the new kind of form factor and upgrading it over the previous Elektron Analog Rytm. The colors were cool, the pads were a slight improvement, although still pretty hard, I thought, compared to other drum machines. There's a lot of good performance features in this, and the sequencer in typical Electron fashion is really well done, especially with some of the probability triggers and things like that. You can get some nice evolving rhythms pretty easily on the Analog Rytm MK2. Unfortunately, I ran into a couple problems with it. For whatever reason, my unit in particular kept having issues with what it seems like was heat buildup. It would freeze or restart. I just had weird graphical glitches in it sometimes. It ended up being something that I was a little concerned about. It wasn't very frequent, but considering I use these things live every once in a while, I just didn't feel like I could really trust it on stage. I know not everyone's having these problems, but definitely mine was exhibiting this, and I could have sent it back and tried another unit, but to be honest, there were some other issues with it that kind of made me think about not keeping it. The first is just the overall sound of it. I don't want to say it sounded bad by any means, like there's a lot of possibilities, but I found I had to really work hard to get the drum sounds to kind of flesh out the way I wanted. There's not a ton of sound shaping capabilities on the Rytm compared to some other drum machines these days. Again, it's not bad, but it was a lot of work for me to kind of get my drum beats sounding exactly the way I wanted. It wasn't a very quick process like I would have hoped it would have been. Coupled with that was the fact that the drum synths could only be assigned to certain pads on the unit. You couldn't change the actual layout of where the drum synths were. I understand it's like a fixed analog signal path, but I still found it strange that this kind of digital front end, these drum pads that were probably setting digital messages, couldn't be remapped to the analog signal path somehow. So like hi-hats would be in a place I wasn't used to, or like the kicks were in a weird spot compared to what I was used to. I just couldn't organize my kits the way I wanted. Or the way I have for many years with other pieces of gear, and it ended up being really kind of frustrating to me. I kept going to reach for a drum sound and tweak it, and then realizing it wasn't the drum sound I would normally have assigned to that pad in a 16x16 4x4 grid. So ultimately, those two things were probably the biggest issues I had with the Analog Rytm MK2, and I ended up sending that back, mostly because it was faulty, not working properly. The replacement I got for that, the other drum machine I thought would replace that, I was also curious about, was the Roland TR8S, and this one actually exceeded all my expectations. It sounded great right out of the box. It was really easy to dial in drum sounds that I liked. It came with a huge range of sounds, both kind of the modeled ones, the ACB technology, as well as the samples in there. The fact you could load your own stereo samples is really nice. It almost takes it into groovebox territory. Like I had when I had my TR8S, I had it loaded up with all kinds of stereo, like bass lines and leads and pads and stuff, and had some real like kind of like basic song foundation building happening just in a drum machine. There's also a ton of effects and lots of performance sequencing features too, with the fills you can add and things like that. Overall, I think Roland did a really good job with that drum box. It was probably their best drum machine to date, and I actually was quite impressed with it. The downside of the TR8S is there is a lot of menu diving once you get past the front panel controls. Plus some things were a little strange as far as like the effects options they gave you and things like that. But overall, I really like the TR8S. If it hadn't been for another piece of gear, I probably would still have it. That piece of gear was the MC507, which for me has been absolute joy to use. I love this box so much. I'm going to do a full follow-up review now that I've had it for a few months here shortly. But basically, once I got used to the MC707, I found myself using the TR8S quite a bit less. Granted, you don't have the same amount of control over the ACB drums on the MC707. They are all sample based. And there are some sound differences between the two, like when you call up 808 kicks and 909 hi-hats and things like that. But overall, they were close enough that it wasn't really a big deal to me, and I didn't really find myself missing the finer control over the ACB parameters. The sample editing function in the MC707 actually kind of added some more functionality, and there's a ton more effects in here as well. So ultimately, I decided I probably was never going to use the TR8S and the 707 together. They're both pretty complex on their own. I don't really like jumping back and forth between boxes too much most of the time. So I decided just to focus on the MC707 for now, and ended up selling the TR8S to somebody I knew who was looking for one. I highly recommend it though, especially if you like Roland drum samples. If you're a big 808 909 fan, I mean, just being able to call up like an 808 kit and have all the parameters mapped on the front panel just to tweak away at was really, really cool. It sounds great. There's a lot of flexibility there, a little bit of menu diving, but overall, I don't think that detracts from the whole package. Kind of related to the MC707, which I alluded to in my first video about it, was the Roland MC505 I had for a brief time again. The 505 was my first groove box. It's what got me into groove boxes and making music many years ago. I searched for a long time to find another one in mint condition, and luckily was able to find one in the Seattle area. I really, really enjoyed it. It was cool to kind of revisit something that was so fundamental to like my career in music to this date. The downside of it is this age was really showing. I got it right before the 707 came out, and after going through the manual a few times to kind of reacquaint myself with it, like it was just a slow and tedious box to use. Surprisingly more fully featured in terms of like MIDI sequencing than you see in a lot of groove boxes or even standalone sequencers today. There is a lot of flexibility in there considering how old it is, but the downside of that is you spend a lot of time menu diving, looking at what you're trying to find. The basic presets and samples in there are okay by today's standards. They're a little cheesy, but for some lo-fi styles or as like a backing track or accompaniment or just adding percussion stuff, I could have maybe seen using it. But ultimately, a couple weeks after I got it, the MC707 dropped, and again, like the TR8S, like I love this thing. It just totally made the 505 redundant and just painful to use. So despite having spent probably 10 or 15 years looking for a replacement, again, I ended up selling that one. I knew it was just something I wasn't going to use and would sit in the closet to be pulled out every few years just for nostalgia's sake. Powered on and then kind of cringed at and put back in the closet. So that one had to go. Another piece of gear that I had for quite a while that I actually never got to do a review on, though I wanted to, was the Arteria Microfreak. I was intrigued from this right from the get-go. It had a really unique kind of synthesis workflow. The whole Buchla style keypad thing I thought was really interesting. It's hard to beat for the price. For $300, it was kind of like a whim purchase for me. I was actually more impressed with it once I used it than I thought I would be on paper. The OLED display is really crisp and offers like really good feedback for the parameters. The mod matrix layout's unique for the size, like there's a lot of functionality there. The sequencer itself and the ARP were way more fully featured than I expected. I think just having the synth engine with that sequencer like as a standalone package alone makes it worthwhile, plus some of the random probability things you can do with the touch strips. Which brings me to my biggest complaint with the Microfreak was those kind of touch strip keypad Buchla style easel things. They're really cool in theory, but for some reason my hands are just drier than most people's, I guess. I had a lot of problems getting it to, to respond to my playing. Right away, like with the aftertouch, the pressure, you can, more of your finger pad makes contact with it and it kind of simulates aftertouch. I had to like basically lick my fingers or wet them right before I did that every single time to get it to register. And even not even talking about the whole like aftertouch thing, like it would just miss my finger touches all the time. It was just almost impossible for me to play. One of the reasons I got it was that nice portable form factor. And on that note, you can actually power it from like a cell phone battery charger. You don't even need to carry like a big powerful charger. You can use this little tiny power brick to charge it and take it with you like, park or something, which is great. So I didn't really want to add like a MIDI keyboard to it just to use it. Like it kind of defeated the purpose for me. And the other problem I had with it kind of was the whole monosynth aspect. This has kind of been an ongoing problem of mine lately, which I'll talk about again in a second, but very quickly I found myself getting frustrated with, just being limited to monosynth, especially when the synth engine itself in something like the Microfreak is, I really enjoy. There's a lot of flexibility there. It sounds cool. It just does things that a lot of other synths I've used don't do. But I keep hitting that monosynth wall where like I only get one voice at a time or maybe two. And I just end up being really frustrated. So that combined with the fact I just couldn't really play with my fingers for whatever reason, and this is probably just me and my fingers being really dry. Unfortunately, that ended up going to a good friend of mine had been talking about it for a long time, so I was happy to help him out with the used one. And that unfortunately went bye-bye. Another thing I had in the studio that I used quite a bit and never got to review, even though I wanted it to, was the Teenage Engineering OPZ. Another box that I was hugely impressed with in person. Having used the OP1 quite a bit, I was curious to see how it compares, and to me there was no comparison. I think the OPZ is vastly better than the OP1 in almost every way, which I know a lot of people will disagree with. I think overall the sounds it makes are more in line with more modern music and the kind of things I like to do. It just sounds fuller, the effects are richer, the reverbs sound better, it's got a master compressor. The sequencing functionality is insane. All the different things you can do to make these evolving little sequences that just go on forever are really unique, really creative. I thought the app built in with the phone was done really well and really made it a lot easier to use. I needed to rely on that a lot more than I wanted to. I found unless I was using the OPZ pretty regularly, like at least 3 or 4 times a week, like I was very easy to forget some of the button combinations to do things, and I'd have to revert back to the app to figure that out. Kind of one of the frustrating things about the app is there's actually a section in the app for the manual, but you have to be connected online to actually read the manual. Like, even though there's an app and they could include the manual in the app, you still have to be online to use it. So that was kind of frustrating, since one of the reasons I got the OPZ was for its portability, and I could just take it out in the woods to make music. Kind of another thing that was the downside on that front was, and I was warned of this ahead of time, was that the LEDs aren't very bright. And once you get even in, not even bright sunlight, but just outside in generally kind of bright light, it can be really hard to see exactly which buttons are lit up and which aren't. So I was hoping it wouldn't be as bad as it was, because I really like that unit, but my main purpose for it would be something I could throw in my backpack on my bike rides and go out in the woods or at a park and make music. And it was just kind of difficult for me to use outside that way. I just couldn't see it very well. And like I said, just unless you use it regularly, I found myself easily forgetting some of the more esoteric key combinations that I wanted to use. That being said, it is still pretty easy to pick up and use. Like, they've done a lot of really interesting UI choices that make sense once you understand it. Again, I was really impressed with the OPZ. It sounds great. It was really fun to use. It does things really differently when it comes to sequencing and some of the probability functionality. The way it will conform notes like on your melody track to your chords to your bass line. You can actually like generate notes like all within a certain key and things like that. There's just a really quick way to come up with cool sounds. Plus you can randomize the synths and the drum engines and things like that, which is always fun. So it was a fun little unit, but the main reason I got it was for outdoor use, when I'm out traveling and doing things outside. And for just a few reasons there, I just kind of struggled with it. It didn't really lend itself to that workflow as much as I would have liked. I'm a big fan of iOS music making on my phone and iPad, and for that kind of scenario where I'm outside, like those still, for me at least, are just better options, using apps like Groovebox and things like that. So yeah, again, the OPZ ended up getting sold. I was impressed by it. I thought it was much better than the OP1, but at the end of the day, it just wasn't really fulfilling the role I needed for it as like a portable tool that I could use outside without having to worry about bright lights and things like that. The last thing on my list is also the newest thing on my list, which is going to be the Sequential Pro 3 Special Edition. I've only had this for maybe 6 weeks or so. I'll be honest, we had some teething problems with it with the hardware. The pitch bend wheel on mine was extremely loose, and I had to open it up to fix that. It was at the point where it was ready to fall out. I also had problems with the cutoff knob. Like, the cutoff value would just kind of start changing by itself, and when that happens, based on the way the Pro 3 works, it would override the display. Like, the cutoff value would pop up on the display and I couldn't change anything else. Like, clearly the pot was faulty. To their credit, Sequential did a great job in being really responsive to my concerns. They sent me a new pot right away, as well as instructions on how to open it up myself. It's built really well and built to service, so it wasn't too hard for like an end user to take apart and fix that. Unfortunately, the second pot they sent me was also faulty. It was very scratchy. There was like no lubricant inside it or something. I'm not sure. Even though the values weren't jumping anymore, it felt wrong to turn. So they sent me a third one, which they tested themselves first. Much props for that. But by this point, it had been like 3 or 4 weeks that I couldn't use the Pro 3 waiting for all this to happen, so it was a little frustrating. I bought it to kind of really focus on during all this COVID lockdown stuff, and dedicated a large part of my schedule to learning that and using that, and couldn't do so. And then the other problem I had with it is, like I mentioned with the Microfreak, I kept kind of butting into that whole monosynth aspect. Now, I know I shouldn't be surprised when I buy monosynths that they're monosynths, but the paraphonic mode didn't quite cover me as much as I would have hoped it would have. which is a shame because so much of this synth is amazing. The mod matrix and the way you assign things is some of the best I've ever seen. I love the sequencer on the Pro 3. I think I've said it before in my review, it could probably be a standalone product. It's really, really well done. In general, I thought the Pro 3 hit almost all the marks I needed in a synth, except for the fact that it was a mono synth. And I found myself using it and comparing it to my OB6 module, and I just kept wanting to use my OB6 module. The sounds were, I don't want to say similar because they do sound quite a bit different, but the kind of workflow is similar, and for the roles I wanted the Pro 3 to do, like the OB6 still was better at those. So the other problem I had with the Pro 3 SE was the sound of it. Again, it's really, really good, that distorted kind of tearing sound. I mean, it likes to break up and go into crazy land, and that's great. But I just really struggled to get like kind of clean, beautiful sounds out of it. And that's just me more than the function of the synth. Like just the layout and the build quality of the synth, not the build quality, the layout and like the effects that are included and stuff, they're all just more grittier, it feels like. And they just kept leading me down that path, no matter how many times I tried to stay to like a brighter and cleaner path. It's just what that synth excels at. So yeah, I just felt like I was fighting it again, like the whole monosynth capability. Like I'd get really, really cool patch going and go and hit a chord or create a texture and, you know, not be able to do it, or there'd be voices stealing in paraphonic mode, things like that. So again, I was really impressed with it. Other than the teething problems I had with some of the hardware components, the build quality is excellent. It looks amazing. It's a cool looking synth. The knobs and everything feel really good. Obviously, again, other than, you know, the fault I had in mind initially. But at the end of the day, I just felt like my OB6 better fit the role I needed out of like an analog synth. So the Pro 3 SE will be up for sale shortly. I'm gonna hang on to it for a couple more weeks just in case, but it's been a really interesting synth to play with, and I'm impressed with what Sequential's done with it. But at the same time, I just know that it's not really quite what I'm looking for, especially given how much it costs. It's not a cheap synth. This SE version is like $2,100 US. So. In the meantime, yeah, I've got one new thing here that I will be talking about soon, the ASM Hydrosynth. I'll do a full review on that shortly. I've only had it a couple days. This is specifically meant to replace the Pro 3 SE. I want something I can use with the MC707. I like the form factor a little better. I could probably use these two plus the OB6, and I have like too large of a setup. So even though the Hydrosynth is vastly different from what the Pro 3 was, I kind of bought both of those with the same intention of pairing them with the 707 as like an extra voice or an extra channel. And I think ultimately the Hydrosynth will be a little more flexible in that regard. So stay tuned. I'll be doing a full review of that shortly. Again, like I also mentioned, I'll be doing kind of a follow-up long-term review of the MC707. Now that I've had it for quite a few months, I've spent a lot of time on it. But anyway, just wanted to kind of touch base on some of the items I've reviewed in the past, as well as some that I didn't get to review, let people know my thoughts on them. I know my opinions are not going to be the same everybody has. A lot of the faults I find in this gear might be minimal for some people, but I've been making music long enough that when I find things I think are going to kind of impede my workflow or slow me down, or a piece just isn't quite fitting the exact role I intended, I have no problems about, you know, flipping it and getting something else I think will fit that role. So that's what happened with a lot of these pieces of gear. Anyway, if you have any questions about any of those, or you disagree and want to share your thoughts, which I'm sure some of you will, go ahead and put them in the comments. Please be courteous, be nice, and I will try to respond to those as quickly as I can. Thanks everybody, and stay tuned for some new reviews coming shortly.